The night wind lashes the Newport cliffs as a carriage stops at a mansion that doesn't speak. Dorothy Whitcomb, banished by her own father, steps across a threshold of polished silence to serve a reclusive tycoon scarred by tragedy. Chandeliers glitter like witnesses. Curtains tremble with rumors. In these halls, duty is a cage, desire a spark, and a single unopened letter could set a family's fate ablaze. Is she punishment, or the key to waking a house that forgot how to breathe? A past returns, a secret stirs, and one impossible choice waits at the door. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and what do you love most about period romances? The longing, the scandal, or the redemption? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1899. The Atlantic wind rolled in over the cliffs with a solemn whisper, brushing against the stone facades of mansions built to impress, conceal, and endure. Among them stood the Ashbury estate, perched on the edge of the cliff walk, like a ship anchored in time. Its walls were lined with ivy and silence, its great windows reflecting not only the sea, but a sorrow that lingered in the very air. Dorothy Whitcomb arrived not as a guest, but as a consequence. The wheels of her father's carriage had barely stopped crunching over the gravel before she was ushered out without ceremony. The driver did not help her down. The footman did not offer a welcome. Her trunk, modest and leather-bound, was placed at her feet with the quiet finality of a verdict, and above her, rising like a judgment, the great stone house loomed. She wore a dove-grey travelling dress with sleeves fastened at the wrist by mother-of-pearl buttons. The fabric, once chosen with care, now felt like armour. A straw hat shaded her hazel eyes from the sun, but not from the stares she imagined behind every curtain. She tightened the ribbon beneath her chin as the front door opened. A man in his late 40s stood just beyond the threshold, leaning slightly on a mahogany cane. Theodore Ashbury. His presence was not imposing in the traditional sense. There was no booming voice, no overt gesture of power. Yet the gravity in his gaze, the way his silence filled the space between them, made her straighten her spine. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was impeccably combed back. A neatly trimmed beard framed his mouth. Though no warmth softened it, he did not extend a hand. "Miss Whitcomb," he said at last, with the tone of someone confirming a delivery. "Mr. Ashbury." Her voice did not tremble. If he noticed the flush in her cheeks or the tightness in her grip on her gloves, he gave no sign. A younger woman appeared behind him, perhaps a housemaid or governess, motioning Dorothy to follow. No welcome, no introduction. She stepped across the threshold alone, as though entering a church where no prayers were ever spoken aloud. The entry hall was vast and echoing, lit only by filtered daylight through arched windows. Portraits of generations past looked down with eyes that had long ceased to see. The scent of lemon oil and polished wood lingered in the air, but beneath it was something colder, dust, perhaps, or grief. Dorothy was led up a narrow staircase at the rear of the house, far from the ornate front rooms she glimpsed in passing. Her chambers were on the second floor, facing the ocean. Modest, clean, impersonal. A servant set down her trunk and departed without a word. She was alone. Only then did Dorothy allow herself to exhale. She removed her hat and gloves slowly, her fingers trembling for the first time. She walked to the window and opened it. The salt air filled the room like a sigh from the sea. This was not exile to some distant place. It was something worse. She had been placed where everyone would see her and yet never speak her name again. Her father had called it charity, spoken with that cold smile he wore when disguising punishment as principle. She had shamed him, refusing a proposal from Mr. Havering, a man more than twice her age with tobacco-stained teeth and fingers that lingered too long on her wrist. Her refusal had been calm, quiet, firm. That perhaps had enraged her father most of all. She had not wept, she had not begged, and now she was here. The hours passed with the stillness of a house that did not expect change. At dinner, she was not summoned. A tray appeared in her room, a silver dome over boiled chicken and steamed carrots, untouched. The next morning she dressed in a soft blue day gown with ivory lace trim, her hair pinned in a modest chignon. She presented herself in the drawing room precisely at 9, as instructed. Theodore Ashbury was already seated, reading a newspaper. A cane rested against the arm of his chair, the sunlight catching the silver of its handle. His eyes lifted briefly when she entered. "Punctuality is a virtue, Miss Whitcomb." "So is conversation," she replied before she could stop herself. A flicker crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, but it passed. "My children will require your company in the afternoons. Mornings are reserved for their lessons. You will not interfere with their tutors. Your duty is to assist with transitions, ensure decorum during outings, and provide a civil presence during meals." He paused. "They do not require affection." She said nothing. "Is that understood?" "No," she answered softly. Another pause. "Children always require affection," she added, with the quiet force of someone who had once gone without. He did not respond. She turned and left the room without awaiting dismissal. Her cheeks burned, but her spine did not bow. Later that day, she was introduced to the children in the garden. Lila, 12, offered a curtsy so polished it might have been carved from marble. Charlie, 8, clung to a wooden ship in his hands and did not meet her eyes. Neither smiled. Dorothy knelt before them on the gravel path, the scent of roses brushing past in the wind. "It's very nice to meet you," she said gently, not with authority, but with honesty. "You don't have to speak today or tomorrow, but I will be here." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of watching. As the children walked away, she did not follow. She remained seated in the garden, allowing the wind to play with the hem of her skirts, her gloved hands resting in her lap. The house watched from behind its windows, austere and distant. But Dorothy was not made of glass or silence. She had been sent here as punishment, and perhaps that was exactly what would make this place tremble. The days that followed passed like mist along the coast, grey, hushed, lingering in the corners of every hallway. Dorothy rose each morning before the servants began their quiet procession through the house, dressing by the pale light that filtered through the lace curtains of her second-floor chamber. She had always believed that silence could be peaceful. But this silence, the one that wrapped itself around the Ashbury estate, was not peaceful. It was weight. It was memory. It was mourning made permanent. She descended the stairs with care, her footsteps echoing faintly against marble floors, too polished to feel warm. No music greeted her, no birdsong from the open windows, only the steady ticking of a long case clock in the entry hall, a sound that seemed to remind everyone in the house how much time had passed since something joyous had last occurred. The household staff moved like shadows, polite but emotionally absent. Mrs. Carter, the housekeeper, gave instructions in a whisper, as if raising her voice might awaken something best left dormant. The maids nodded, bowed, disappeared. No one lingered, no one chatted, and no one asked questions. Dorothy kept her questions to herself. But she observed, she noticed that the windows in the children's playroom were always half-closed, as if sunlight was something to be rationed. The grand piano in the music room was immaculate, polished weekly, untouched daily. Above it hung a portrait of a woman with a soft, pale face and wistful eyes. Theodore's late wife, no doubt. Her gaze followed Dorothy whenever she crossed the room. The frame was gilded but dusted with such meticulous care that Dorothy sensed a ritual in the act, an offering, or perhaps penance. One afternoon, while waiting for Lila and Charlie to finish their lesson with the French tutor, Dorothy lingered in the music room. She did not sit. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the space, fingertips grazing the carved wood of the furniture, the curve of the harp in the corner, the velvet on the settee. She came upon a small escritoire with a locked drawer. It was a beautiful piece, ivory inlay, mother-of-pearl knobs, but it had not been used in some time. On its surface sat a stack of correspondence tied with a ribbon, unopened, postmarks from the spring. One envelope bore a red wax seal now cracked at the edges. She did not touch them, but her heart did. That evening, after dinner, taken alone in her room again, a meal of roasted chicken and chilled fruit she barely tasted, Dorothy lit the small oil lamp on her writing desk. Her journal lay before her, unopened. She stared at it for several minutes before finally reaching for a worn volume of poetry instead. Tucked inside its pages was a folded sheet of parchment, blank until now. She began to write, not to anyone, not for anyone. It was not a letter of protest nor of longing. It was a confession of fear, of resolve, of the hollowness she felt sitting beside a child who would not speak and a man who refused to see, of the way the ocean air tangled in her hair but could not unweave the knots in her heart, of how much she missed the sound of laughter and how she had never truly noticed its absence in her life until now. She folded the letter and slipped it into the pages of the book again, between lines about the sea and memory. Her fingers paused over the spine before she closed it gently, sealing the moment inside. The next day, she was seated on a bench in the side garden when Charlie approached her without speaking. He carried a wooden ship, its sails worn from handling, its hull carved with initials too small to read. He did not look at her. He simply sat beside her, the toy nestled in his lap like something fragile. Dorothy did not speak either. She waited. Minutes passed. The wind stirred the rose bushes. Somewhere beyond the hedges, the gardener's shears made soft, rhythmic snips. Charlie's small shoulders shifted slightly, as if bracing for something. He placed the ship on the bench between them and nudged it toward her. "It doesn't float anymore," he whispered. Her chest tightened. She looked at the ship, then at him. "It doesn't have to," she said. "It's already carried so much." He said nothing more, but he did not leave. That evening, Theodore joined her in the drawing room. It was the first time since her arrival that he had not remained cloistered in his study after sundown. He moved slowly, each step supported by the silver-handled cane. He wore a navy waistcoat over a white shirt with French cuffs, unadorned but crisply pressed. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the tired lines at the corners of his mouth. "You were in the music room yesterday," he said. "I was. I prefer it undisturbed." I noticed. A silence stretched between them, not hostile, not yet familiar. He seated himself in the chair near the hearth, though there was no fire. His eyes drifted to the portrait on the wall. "She used to play every evening, after supper, the same 3 pieces. I can't remember the last one anymore." Dorothy followed his gaze. "She's very beautiful," she said. "Yes," he murmured, then turned his attention back to her. "You're not here to replace her." "I couldn't," Dorothy replied, her voice even. "But I will not be a ghost either." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or something deeper, but it was gone before she could be sure. The next morning, Lila spoke first. "Miss Whitcomb," she said, standing in the doorway of the library, "may I sit with you in the garden later?" Dorothy smiled gently. "I would like that very much." That afternoon, they sat under the arbor as clouds gathered low on the horizon. Lila wore a pale pink frock with lace at the cuffs and a ribbon in her hair the color of champagne. Her posture was perfect, her words carefully chosen. "My mother never liked rain," she said suddenly. "She said it made the house forget how to be warm." Dorothy looked up at the sky, then back at the girl. "Then we must light the lamps early and remind it." For the briefest moment, Lila smiled. Dorothy thought of the sealed letters in the escritoire, of the locked drawer and the unopened music box she suspected lay inside, of the man who walked like each step reminded him of something lost, and the children who spoke in fragments of memory instead of dreams. This house did not speak because it was listening to the past, to the silences between words, to footsteps that no longer echoed in its halls. But Dorothy Whitcomb had never been one to whisper where she could speak clearly, and she had no intention of fading into the walls of this house, no matter how long it had been since it had remembered how to feel alive. The morning began with an unexpected stillness, the kind that arrives before a change of tide. The air along the Newport coast carried a gentle assault, the sea whispering rather than roaring. From her window, Dorothy saw the faint shimmer of sunlight turning the Atlantic into sheets of gold. For the first time since her arrival, she felt an impulse to leave the walls behind. She dressed in a simple gown of pale lavender linen, practical and light, and gathered her hair with a ribbon. The children were in the schoolroom with their governess, reciting French verbs without spirit. Through the open doorway, Dorothy could hear their voices, steady, flat, as if spoken by habit rather than curiosity. "Madame Lefebvre," Dorothy said softly, appearing in the threshold. "May I take them for a walk by the shore? The morning is too fine to waste indoors." The governess looked startled. "Mr. Ashbury prefers they remain within the grounds." Dorothy smiled with a calm that masked her defiance. "Then we shall remain within sight of them." Lila lifted her head at the word shore, her blue eyes brightening, as if the very thought of the sea had brushed away the fog that lingered around her. Charlie, seated by the window, clutched the wooden ship he never let out of his grasp. Minutes later, they stepped beyond the garden gate. The path to the beach wound down through tall grasses that swayed in the breeze, brushing against their skirts and trousers. Lila carried a parasol, though she forgot to open it. Charlie walked beside Dorothy in silence, his small hand holding tightly to his ship. When the sea came into view, it was alive, waves cresting in soft curls, the foam gliding toward their feet like a beckoning hand. The horizon stretched endlessly, a promise and a secret at once. Dorothy inhaled deeply, her eyes closing as the breeze lifted strands of her hair. "May we?" Lila's voice trailed off, unsure. "You may," Dorothy said, slipping off her shoes. "And so may I." She stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the damp sand. The water met her with a cold shock that made her laugh, quiet but genuine. It startled the children more than the sea itself. Lila hesitated only a moment before gathering her skirts and following. Charlie lingered behind, his expression a careful mixture of longing and fear. Dorothy turned back toward him. "It's all right, Charlie. The water won't take you." He shook his head. "Then let it meet you halfway," she said, kneeling in the sand so her eyes met his. "You can stand where it reaches your toes and no further. But come see how the waves remember to return, no matter how far they go." Something in her tone, gentle yet steady, reached him. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. When the foam touched his shoes, he gasped softly. Dorothy smiled. "That's all it asks of you," she whispered. The wind lifted the hem of her gown as Lila began to laugh, spinning in small circles, her hair coming loose from its ribbon. The sound carried up the cliffside, bright and startling in its newness. Dorothy joined her, laughing too, until Charlie's laughter, uncertain and small, broke free like a secret set loose. He crouched, placed his ship upon the wet sand, and watched as the next wave rolled beneath it. The little vessel rocked, swayed, and for an instant floated. His smile was shy but real. The world seemed to pause. Later, when they began their walk back, Lila's cheeks were pink and her parasol forgotten entirely. Charlie carried his damp ship with pride, and Dorothy, her skirts damp and shoes in hand, felt a warmth that no fire in the Ashbury house had ever managed to kindle. From one of the upper balconies, Theodore watched them return. He had been reading reports from the Rail Commission, but had found himself distracted by the sound. Was it laughter? He rose and crossed to the window, leaning slightly on his cane. Below, he saw the scene unfold. Dorothy walking barefoot across the lawn, her hair loosened by the wind, Lila and Charlie chasing her shadow. A flash of sunlight touched her face as she looked up toward the house, though she could not have seen him. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest, a sensation both tender and painful. He watched as she stopped at the edge of the garden and bent to whisper something to Charlie, who nodded solemnly before running off. Her hand brushed the side of her skirt as if brushing away sand, and in that small, unconscious gesture he saw what the house had been missing: life not arranged by duty, but animated by warmth. That evening Dorothy found the drawing. It was tucked beneath her door, the edges smudged with charcoal. She lifted it carefully. The sketch was simple: a woman standing ankle-deep in the sea, skirts lifted slightly, hair swept by the wind. Behind her, 2 children laughed in the surf. She recognized the hand at once. Charlie's. The paper trembled between her fingers. She set it on her writing desk and sat for a long time without moving. Her reflection in the window blurred with the night outside. When Mrs. Carter brought her evening tea, Dorothy folded the drawing and slipped it inside her book, beside the letter she had written to herself days ago. "Mrs. Carter," she said after a pause, "how long has it been since this house has heard a child laugh?" The housekeeper hesitated, setting the tray down. "Not since before Mrs. Ashbury passed, miss. The master doesn't allow much noise. He says the walls echo too easily." Dorothy turned to face her, her eyes calm but glistening. "Walls do echo easily, but they also learn to listen." Mrs. Carter, caught between surprise and admiration, murmured, "You speak as though the house were alive." "Perhaps it is," Dorothy said softly. "It just forgot how to breathe." Later, unable to sleep, she walked through the hallways in her nightgown, the hem brushing the carpet. The air carried the scent of old smoke and lavender polish. She stopped outside the music room and rested her hand on the closed door. Somewhere beyond it lay the locked drawer she had discovered before, the unopened letters, the untouched piano. Inside, she imagined the melody that might once have filled the space: the late Mrs. Ashbury at the keys, Theodore listening with his eyes closed, the children chasing notes around the room. She imagined laughter breaking like light through dust. Her throat tightened. "Miss Whitcomb," came a voice behind her. She turned. It was Theodore. He wore no jacket, only a shirt and waistcoat, his cane in hand. The corridor lamp cast gold upon his face, making the blue-grey of his eyes seem softer. "I did not mean to disturb," she said, stepping back. "You didn't," he replied quietly. "I rarely sleep. The sea keeps me awake." "It does that," Dorothy murmured. "It remembers everything." He regarded her for a moment, then glanced toward the closed door. "I suppose you've discovered by now that this house has its rules." "Yes," she said, "and its silences." His lips curved faintly. "You find that troubling?" "I find it unnatural." Another silence, heavier this time. Then, as if conceding something small but significant, he said, "Charlie smiled today." She caught her breath. "You saw us?" He nodded once. "From the balcony." Dorothy folded her hands before her, unsure what to say. She feared any wrong word might undo the fragile kindness that had entered the air between them. "The boy hasn't smiled since the accident," he said at last. "I'm not certain he remembers how to." "He does," Dorothy whispered. "Children remember joy the way the sea remembers the shore. It only needs to be reminded." He held her gaze a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. The lamp flickered between them. "Good night, Miss Whitcomb," he said, and turned toward his study. "Good night, Mr. Ashbury." When he had gone, Dorothy remained a moment longer, her pulse steady, but her chest trembling. She touched the door of the music room again, as if sealing a promise not yet spoken, then returned to her chamber. Before extinguishing her lamp, she unfolded Charlie's drawing one more time. The charcoal lines caught the light, faint but certain, like footprints on the sand before the tide returns. She placed it beside her pillow and whispered into the darkness, "No house should forget the sound of the sea." And as she drifted to sleep, the wind from the cliffs carried the faintest echo of children's laughter, a sound she could not be sure was real, yet one that made the great silent house breathe again. The last of the summer days stretched long across the Newport sky, heavy with golden light that lingered until the very edge of evening. The sea, restless but calm in its rhythm, struck the rocks below the Ashbury cliffs in a melody of foam and echo. Within the great house overlooking that horizon, the silence had begun to shift, so subtly that no one dared name it. It was not laughter yet, but an expectancy, a breath drawn before the words that might finally be spoken. That afternoon, Dorothy had walked with the children through the gardens, her parasol closed at her side, the breeze playing with the ribbons of her hat. Charlie clutched his wooden ship as always, and Lila, who had begun to hum quietly as they walked, stopped to pick small daisies and weave them into a chain. It was an ordinary day by all appearance, yet Dorothy felt that some invisible weight, was beginning to lift. When the sun began to lower, painting the sky in pinks and deep ambers, Dorothy paused by the wide doors leading to the veranda. From there, she could see the faint shimmer of a brass telescope, half hidden behind a covered table. It was long unused, forgotten under a thin layer of dust. She remembered Mrs. Carter mentioning, in a whisper, that the instrument had belonged to Mrs. Ashbury, who had loved the stars. Dorothy hesitated, her gloved hand hovering above the velvet cloth that draped it. Then, with slow care, she pulled the cover away. The brass caught the fading light, gleaming faintly as if remembering its purpose. "May we see it?" Lila asked, her voice a delicate mix of curiosity and restraint. Dorothy smiled. "Yes, I believe it's time this house looked at the sky again." By twilight the children had changed into their evening clothes, and Dorothy had lit several lanterns on the veranda, their light dancing softly against the railings. The air smelled of salt and lilac, and the hum of crickets mingled with the rhythm of the sea below. When Theodore Ashbury appeared, he stopped at the doorway. His cane tapped lightly against the wooden floor, the sound precise, deliberate. He was dressed in a dark waistcoat and white shirt, the top button left undone in rare informality. His eyes, grey-blue and shadowed, caught the glimmer of the telescope and stilled. "I had forgotten that still existed," he said quietly. Dorothy turned to him, her tone gentle but steady. "I thought the children might like to see the stars." He did not reply at once. His gaze rested on the instrument, and for a fleeting second she saw something unguarded in his expression. An ache, perhaps, or memory. He stepped forward, resting a hand on the telescope, as if reacquainting himself with something both dear and forbidden. "She used to spend hours with it," he murmured, half to himself. "The night before the accident she was here, watching the Perseids. She said they looked like tears across the sky." Dorothy said nothing, only adjusted the telescope with care. Lila stood beside her, eyes wide with anticipation. Charlie hovered behind, clutching his small ship even now. "Would you like to look, Miss Whitcomb?" Theodore asked suddenly. She glanced at him, surprised by the invitation. "If you wish." He gestured for her to go first, and she bent slightly to the lens. The air trembled faintly around them. Through the glass she saw the moon, brilliant, enormous, edged in silver light, and for a moment the world fell silent. "It's beautiful," she whispered. No wonder she loved it. When she looked up, Theodore was watching her. Their eyes met for a heartbeat longer than decorum allowed. Then he turned to Lila. "Come," he said softly. "Your mother used to say the stars kept secrets for those who remembered to ask." Lila approached the telescope with reverence. She looked through it, then gasped. "Papa, it's glowing!" Theodore's lips curved faintly. "It's the light from centuries ago, my dear. We are always seeing the past, even when we think it's the present." Dorothy felt the words echo within her like a distant bell. Perhaps that was what this house had been doing all along, seeing the past, unable to look away. Then, without warning, Charlie spoke. His voice was soft, uncertain, but full of wonder. "It's alive," he said, looking up at the stars with wide eyes. The world seemed to still around them. It was the first full sentence he had spoken in months. Lila turned to him, astonished. Dorothy's breath caught. Even Theodore's grip on his cane loosened slightly. Charlie, oblivious to their awe, continued in a whisper. "It moves, even when everything here stands still." Dorothy felt her throat tighten. She knelt beside him, placing a hand gently over his small fingers. "Yes," she said softly. It does. It never stops. Theodore looked at his son, his expression unreadable. His jaw shifted as though holding back words too heavy to release. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You should both go inside," he said quietly to the children. "It's getting cold." Lila obeyed, guiding her brother back toward the door. Before following, Charlie turned and looked at Dorothy. "Will we see them again tomorrow?" "If you wish," she replied, smiling. When they were gone, Theodore remained by the telescope. The night air pressed softly around them, the waves below murmuring like memory. "She would have liked you," he said suddenly. Dorothy turned, startled. "Your wife?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the sky. "You have her patience and her defiance." She didn't believe in silence either. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the sea striking the rocks far below. Then, with a trace of sadness, he added, "I haven't touched this telescope since the night before she died. I couldn't bring myself to look at anything so infinite when everything I knew had ended." Dorothy felt her pulse quicken, though her voice remained calm. "Sometimes, Mr. Ashbury, what we see in the distance helps us understand what's still near." His eyes met hers briefly, sharper this time, as if her words had found a place they weren't meant to go. Then he turned toward the door. "Good night, Miss Whitcomb." "Good night," she said softly, though he was already gone. Later that evening, unable to rest, Dorothy wandered the house once more. The lamps had been dimmed, and the corridors glowed faintly in amber light. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpeted floor as she moved through the shadows. Drawn by something she could not name, she stopped at the door of the music room. The air inside was cool, touched with the faint scent of polished wood and rosewater. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, falling in silver ribbons across the grand piano. Dorothy crossed the room quietly. She approached the escritoire, the one with the locked drawer she had noticed days earlier. On its surface still lay the unopened letters, their ribbons faded. The key, she realized, must once have been hidden close by. She searched the small box of writing instruments and found it. Thin, bronze, simple. The lock clicked softly. Inside lay a small music box, its casing of dark cherry wood, the lid inlaid with mother-of-pearl lilies. It was exquisite and delicate, like something that had once been cherished every day. Dorothy lifted it with both hands and set it gently upon the table. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished lid. She hesitated, then turned the key. A lullaby spilled into the stillness, faint but clear, the sound of something tender that had been kept too long in the dark. The melody wound through the air, simple and haunting, each note brushing against her heart. She could almost imagine a woman's hands winding it beside a cradle, the soft laughter of a child, the echo of a time when this house had been alive. Dorothy's eyes glistened. She closed the lid carefully, silencing the tune. Some memories, she thought, were like fragile threads. Touch them too soon, and they break. She placed the box back inside, locked the drawer, and pressed her palm against the cool surface of the desk. Then, standing alone in the moonlit room, she whispered to the emptiness, "Not yet." Outside, the sea answered with a sigh, and far above the cliffs the stars burned, bright, unblinking, eternal witnesses to a house beginning at last, to remember how to feel. The air in Newport that September carried the delicate chill of the approaching autumn. The grand houses along Bellevue Avenue glittered with afternoon light, their lawns trimmed into perfection, their porches filled with ladies in silk and lace sipping tea, as if their lives depended on being seen. In one of those elegant gardens, Dorothy Whitcomb walked carefully behind Lila Ashbury, her gloves pressed together, her expression composed though her heart was less so. She was not meant to belong to this world. Yet she had been summoned into it, invited perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of cruelty. The invitation had come embossed and perfumed, sent by Mrs. Beatrice Hallowell, a matron of impeccable reputation and legendary malice, who had once been a dear friend to Theodore's late wife. A small gathering, the note had said, to honor Mr. Ashbury's family. It was not affection that prompted the gesture. Dorothy knew that well enough. It was the scent of gossip, something new, something scandalous, and she was its centerpiece. The carriage ride to the Hallowell estate was short but suffocating. Lila sat beside Dorothy, her hands clasped tightly over a small reticule. The girl's usual composure seemed thinner today, fragile as the lace at her collar. "Do I have to go, Miss Whitcomb?" she asked quietly. Dorothy forced a smile. "We will go, my dear, because we have been invited, and we will leave when we have been properly seen." Lila frowned. "That sounds like something my father would say. Then perhaps we both understand him better than we think." When the carriage stopped before the ivy-covered mansion, Dorothy drew a slow breath. She stepped down, her lavender gown catching a shaft of sunlight that glimmered through the trees. It was modest compared to the silks around her, but elegant nonetheless. A high neckline trimmed in white lace, the skirt soft and flowing. She wore no jewels, except for a small brooch at her throat, a token of her late mother. The garden was filled with the fragrance of roses and the sharp sweetness of lemon cakes. Ladies in parasols and ribbons drifted like colorful birds, their voices low and their smiles rehearsed. Dorothy could feel their eyes turning toward her, curious, assessing, calculating. "Miss Whitcomb," a voice drawled from the nearest table, "how kind of you to accompany the Ashbury children. You must find life on the cliffs rather isolated." It was Mrs. Hallowell herself, her gown a triumph of cream silk and vanity. She smiled without warmth, lifting her teacup with deliberate grace. Around her, 3 other women leaned forward like an audience, awaiting the first act of a scandal. Dorothy returned the smile, her voice calm. "It is peaceful, Mrs. Hallowell. The sea tends to silence what doesn't matter." A murmur ran through the group. Mrs. Hallowell's eyes sharpened. "Yes, but one must be careful what one silences, don't you think? Houses with too many secrets have a way of echoing." Before Dorothy could reply, Lila stepped forward. "My father says our house keeps no secrets, Mrs. Hallowell. Only memories." The girl's tone was pure steel wrapped in silk. The older women blinked in surprise. Dorothy, stunned but proud, laid a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. "Indeed," she said softly, "and some memories are worth keeping." Mrs. Hallowell smiled again, this time thinner, crueler. "Of course, my dear, you speak beautifully for your age. Your mother must be very proud." Lila's chin lifted, her blue eyes glinting. "My mother is dead," she said, each word like a bell tolling through the garden. "But I imagine she would be prouder still if we remembered to be kind." The silence that followed was exquisite. Mrs. Hallowell's fan stilled mid-air. Someone coughed behind a lace handkerchief. Dorothy inclined her head slightly and said, "Perhaps we should take some air, Lila." As they walked away down the rose path, Dorothy heard the murmurs begin again, low and frantic. The sound of gossip was as familiar as the hum of bees, but this time it did not sting. It sounded hollow, smaller than it once had. When they reached the carriage, Lila turned to Dorothy, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I shouldn't have said that, should I?" Dorothy knelt before her and brushed a lock of hair from her face. "No, my dear, you should have. There is dignity in truth." Lila smiled faintly. "You sounded just like my father when you said that." Dorothy looked away, her heartbeat quickening. "Then I must choose my words more carefully." By the time they returned to the Ashbury estate, the sky had turned the color of faded violets. Theodore was in the library when they entered, a glass of port untouched beside him. His cane rested by the chair. He looked up as they approached, his gaze moving first to his daughter, then to Dorothy. "How was your afternoon?" he asked evenly. Dorothy exchanged a brief glance with Lila. "Educational," she said. The corner of his mouth lifted. "Barely. I imagine it was." Lila curtsied and went to find her brother. When she had gone, Dorothy turned toward him. "You knew what they would say. The Newport society has never needed truth to sharpen its claws," he replied, leaning back. "But you handled them well." Dorothy folded her hands before her. "You shouldn't have let us go." "I didn't let you," he said, his tone soft but cutting. "You went. and I admire you for it." Something in his voice, half compliment, half confession, made her pulse stumble. Their eyes met briefly before she lowered hers. "Your daughter defended me," she said. "They will remember that." "I hope they do," he murmured. "It will remind them that not all refinement is cruelty." For a moment the room seemed smaller, filled with the unspoken, the crackle of the fireplace, the faint sound of waves far below, even the steady tick of the clock. All of it faded into a silence that neither dared to name. That night, unable to sleep, Theodore wandered the halls of his house. He passed the music room, pausing when he noticed the door slightly ajar. The air carried a faint scent of lilac and something sweeter, dust stirred by memory. Inside, on the escritoire, the music box sat uncovered, the faintest trace of moonlight glinting on its mother-of-pearl inlay. Dorothy had found it days ago, though she had never spoken of it. He knew she had touched it. He could feel it. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the lid. Slowly, he turned the key. The lullaby began softly, its first notes uncertain, as if remembering how to breathe. The melody filled the room, tender, sorrowful, achingly familiar. He closed his eyes. The years between then and now collapsed. He saw his wife's hands, slender and pale, winding the key, her laughter echoing faintly through the corridors. He saw her leaning over the cradle, her hair loose, her voice a whisper of comfort. When the music ended, he remained still, his hand resting on the lid. A single tear slid down his cheek, though his face betrayed no movement. He closed the box, the soft click like the ending of a prayer. The next morning at breakfast, Theodore entered the dining room later than usual. Dorothy stood by the window, helping Charlie with his napkin. Lila was buttering toast, humming absently, the same melody from the night before. He stopped. Dorothy turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. He said nothing, but she read something in his expression. A quiet gratitude, perhaps even forgiveness. He took his seat, and for a fleeting moment the air between them was almost warm. That moment would not last. By afternoon, a letter arrived, its seal unbroken, but its presence heavy. Dorothy recognized the handwriting before the butler even spoke. "From Mr. Whitcomb," he said, setting it on the tray. Her father's words were brief, his cruelty as efficient as his penmanship. "You will meet me at the Harbour House tomorrow at 3. I have arranged a proposal from a man of means. You will accept it. If not, I will see to it that Mr. Ashbury's next venture collapses before the ink is dry." Her hands trembled as she folded the letter. She looked toward the hallway where the children's laughter drifted faintly from the parlor. The sound, once her refuge, now pierced her heart. That evening, as the last of the light faded from the sea, Dorothy stood alone on the veranda. Below her, the waves struck the rocks with relentless rhythm, the scent of salt thick in the air. Behind her, the house glowed faintly, its lamps lit, its walls no longer so silent. And somewhere within, Theodore sat at his desk, unaware that the woman who had brought warmth back into his home was already being summoned to choose between the past she fled and the man whose heart she had quietly begun to awaken. The morning began with the sky veiled in gauze-colored clouds, the kind that threatened a storm without ever promising when it might break. The Atlantic was restless again, waves swelling with a quiet menace that mirrored the weight in Dorothy's chest as she descended the staircase of the Ashbury house. The day ahead felt like the edge of a precipice, silent, still, but full of invisible pressure. In the dining room, Theodore Ashbury stood beside the mantel, not seated at the table as usual. He wore a dark wool coat despite the lingering warmth, and his cane rested near his chair. A letter, folded with exacting precision, lay untouched on the table. He looked up as she entered. His eyes searched hers, not with suspicion, but with caution, like a man who had learned to tread carefully around hope. "I received word this morning from your father," he said without preamble. Dorothy remained still. The room was too quiet. He gestured to the letter without touching it. It seems he has concerns about your continued presence in my household. She stepped closer, her hands folded calmly before her, though her spine held every ounce of tension she would not allow to rise to her voice. He wishes me elsewhere, she said simply. Theodore's jaw tightened. He suggests your position here might reflect poorly on the household, on the children. Dorothy's lips parted faintly. And what do you believe, Mr. Ashbury? He hesitated. Her heart beat once, hard, deep, then held its breath. I believe, he said at last, his voice lower, that your presence has done more good for this home than anything else since I lost my wife. And I believe my children smile because of you. Emotion flickered in his gaze. So briefly she might have imagined it, but then he added more deliberately, and I believe that this house will not survive being silenced again. A silence stretched between them, too much to say, too much at stake. Then, with visible effort, he stepped toward her. Dorothy, he said, her name like a promise unspoken, I would like you to stay. It was not a command, not an arrangement. There was no mention of duties or compensation. It was something more fragile and far more dangerous. She looked at him, not just at the man he had become, but at the man who had remained behind his walls far too long. And yet she shook her head. I cannot remain as a guest, nor as an ornament placed for appearances, she said softly. And I will not stay as a kept woman, not even by your kindness. His expression tightened, not with anger but with restraint. What then? He asked. She stepped forward. A partnership, not based on debt, but on purpose. Let me continue what I began here. With the children, with the staff, with you, but not beneath you, beside you. Her words did not tremble, and that, perhaps, affected him most. He regarded her carefully, then, after what felt like a lifetime, he gave the smallest of nods. Beside me, then. That night, in the solitude of her room, Dorothy sat at her writing desk. The moonlight spilled through the window in quiet silver, and her pen scratched across parchment with swift, restrained fury. Father, she began, her script neat and sharp. I will not attend the meeting. I will not consider the proposal. I will not allow you to manipulate my future as punishment for my defiance. I am not the bargaining chip you believe me to be. I have found my place, and it is not beside the man you chose, nor beneath your shadow. Your threats no longer hold weight. Whatever shame you feared, I release it. It is no longer mine to carry. D. Whitcomb. She folded the letter with precision, sealed it with wax, and tucked it into a book she had brought from home, one of the few things her father had not touched. She would post it herself the following morning, directly from the harbour. In the days that followed, Dorothy noticed a quiet hum of preparation within the estate. Linens were aired, crystal was inspected, musicians arrived with instruments wrapped in velvet, servants whispered about a summer musicale, an event not held in years. She found Theodore one morning in the study, reviewing sheet music. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You're planning something," she said. He did not deny it. "If people insist on whispering," he said dryly, "then I intend to give them something to listen to." She stepped forward, drawn by something unspoken between them. "And what exactly do you hope they will hear?" "That the Ashbury name is still worthy," he said quietly. "That my house is not a mausoleum, that my children are not shadows, and that I—" He stopped, then redirected, "that I still have the power to set the terms of my own reputation." Dorothy did not speak, but her gaze did not waver. And in that silence, something passed between them that no invitation could contain. Unbeknownst to her, Theodore had begun something else, a plan as quiet as it was devastating. At night, while the rest of the house slept, he read over ledgers, corresponded with attorneys, and negotiated discreetly with shareholders. Mr. Whitcomb, in his arrogance, had failed to recognize that influence can be bought and sold. Theodore Ashbury, who had once built railroads across impossible terrain, now quietly built a new foundation, one designed to collapse the power of the man who sought to control the woman who had brought his home back to life. Dorothy, unaware, focused on the upcoming musicale. She coached the children in poetry and posture, helped the kitchen plan a menu that honored simplicity over extravagance, and chose the arrangements of flowers with Lila, who now quoted verses while placing roses. There were moments between arrangements and rehearsals where her gaze would meet Theodore's across a hallway or dinner table. No words would be spoken, but something charged would hang between them, unfinished, electric. One afternoon, as she walked through the West Wing to inspect the guest salon, she came upon him adjusting the drapes. The light caught his profile, casting shadows across the sharp line of his cheekbone and the silver at his temple. He paused when he saw her. "You look tired," she said gently. "I feel older," he replied, but there was a softness in his voice. Dorothy tilted her head. "And yet, you carry this house as though it weighs nothing." He met her gaze. "Because I am no longer carrying it alone." They stood in silence for several heartbeats, long enough to feel the space between them shrink, to sense that words would soon become inadequate. But then a knock echoed from the hall, and the moment dissolved like mist under sunlight. Dorothy turned away first. That night, as the wind stirred the curtains in her room and the scent of salt drifted in from the sea, she opened the drawer of her desk and took out the sealed letter to her father. She held it over the flame of the oil lamp for a long, trembling moment. But then, with calm resolve, she blew the flame out instead. The ink was dry. The seal was firm. And the woman who had once been sent away in silence was now finding her voice in the rooms where no one had dared to speak. Outside, the ocean struck the cliffs in its eternal rhythm, and above the house, the stars continued to watch as two lives, one grieving, one rebuilding, prepared to meet the world on their own terms. The storm arrived without warning. By mid-afternoon, the summer sky that had once shimmered with light turned to iron. Winds swept in from the sea, violent and unrelenting, rattling shutters and flattening the roses in the Ashbury gardens. The ocean below thundered against the cliffs, each wave breaking like glass against stone, as if the world itself had grown restless with restraint. Inside the house, the atmosphere was no calmer. Dorothy stood in the drawing room, her hands clasped tightly as the rain lashed the tall windows. The fire behind her burned low, offering little warmth against the storm building, not only outside, but within the walls of the estate. It had begun with a knock, a single sharp rap at the front door, followed by the butler's hesitant entrance and the envelope he handed Theodore without a word. Dorothy hadn't meant to read the headline, but it was impossible not to catch the inked words that screamed from the newspaper now spread across the side table. "Companion or courtesan, the Ashbury Estate's new lady-in-waiting." Beneath it, a smaller line. A reclusive tycoon, a fallen heiress, and the whispers behind the cliff-walk gates. Her name was there. Her father's influence, unmistakable. The article was written with a veneer of politeness, but its venom clung to every syllable, suggesting impropriety, ambition, a scandal cloaked in kindness. Her hands burned with humiliation, her cheeks flushed not with guilt, but fury. "I'm sorry," she said, breaking the silence. "I never meant to bring this upon your household." Theodore did not respond immediately. He stood at the window, his shoulders rigid, the letter from her father clenched in one hand, the newspaper in the other. His profile was carved in shadow, the light flickering from the fireplace, unable to soften the expression on his face. "Do you believe what he says?" she asked, her voice low. Theodore turned then, slowly, and looked at her, not with doubt, but with something else entirely, something closer to anguish. "No," he said, "but the world might." Dorothy's chest rose sharply, as if the breath she had taken could not find its way out. "I will leave," she said. "It's the only way to protect the children." "And your name?" "You will not," came a sudden voice. Both turned toward the doorway. Lila stood there, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with tears and indignation. Behind her, Charlie peeked out from behind the velvet drapes, his small fingers clutching the folds of fabric. "You will not leave," Lila repeated, stepping into the room. "You are not like the others who disappear. You're ours." Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. "Lila, you promised," the girl said, her voice trembling. "You said you would be here, that you would stay." Charlie stepped forward then, walking slowly, and reached for Dorothy's hand. "She's ours," he whispered, the words soft but sure. The storm outside roared as if in answer, shaking the windows in their frames. But inside, the silence that followed Charlie's words was absolute. Theodore looked at his children, his cane trembling in his hand. "I can't lose her too," Lila said, her voice cracking. "Don't let her go like you let Mama go." His face changed then, not visibly, not in any dramatic shift of expression, but in the way his shoulders lowered, the way his eyes dropped to the floor. For the first time, Dorothy saw him not as the composed patriarch of a grieving household, but as a man undone by the weight of love lost and the fear of losing again. He said nothing, not one word, and that silence, more than any speech, carved something deep within her. That night, the storm grew louder. Rain hammered the windows like fists demanding entry, and thunder rolled across the sky with merciless force. The children had long since gone to bed, though Lila had insisted on sleeping in Charlie's room, in case the storm tried to steal him. Dorothy wandered the halls alone, the candle in her hand flickering with every gust of wind that slipped through the crevices of the old house. Her nightgown clung to her calves as she moved, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The door to Theodore's study stood slightly ajar. She paused. Inside, the fire had died low. Papers were scattered across his desk. On top of them sat an envelope, unsealed. The handwriting was unmistakably his. She shouldn't, but something, curiosity, dread, or the ache that had taken residence in her chest, pushed her forward. She stepped inside, fingers trembling, and lifted the letter. "Dorothy," it began. "There are things I cannot say aloud, not because I do not feel them, but because they terrify me. You arrived here as consequence, and yet you became necessity. I have watched my children awaken beneath your presence, and in doing so, I have begun to remember how to breathe. I do not offer you affection in exchange for loyalty. I do not see you as a guest, nor a burden. I see you as the stillness I have needed since the storm that took everything. I fear I have already said too much by writing this, and not enough. Stay, not for them, not for me, but because you are already a part of what we are rebuilding." Dorothy pressed the letter to her chest, closing her eyes as the candlelight flickered violently behind her. She did not know if he had meant for her to find it. She did not know if she could answer it with words of her own. All she knew was that in the midst of a storm, something had shifted, something irreversibly tender. Outside, the wind howled over the cliffs and the sea crashed with fury. But within the walls of the house, a silence bloomed, no longer empty, but expectant. And Dorothy, standing at the edge of what could never be undone, wept without a sound. The sun rose on the day of the musicale with a clarity so piercing it seemed unnatural, like a sky daring to pretend that storms had never touched it. After days of rain and rumblings, both from the heavens and the hearts within the Ashbury estate, Newport greeted the morning with light that gilded every window pane and kissed the roses back into bloom. Servants moved swiftly through the corridors, brass polished, linen pressed, chandeliers checked and rechecked for sparkle. In the dining room, silver glinted with the weight of preparation, and in the parlour, a string quartet rehearsed beneath frescoed ceilings, their instruments tuning the very air into anticipation. But it was the music room, long silent, long shuttered, that had become the centre of it all. Dorothy stood at the threshold, her fingers resting against the carved wooden frame, watching as the last touches were made. The grand piano had been opened, its polished surface gleaming beneath the afternoon light. Candles had been placed along the mantels in tall glass holders, and sheer curtains billowed like whispered memories across the tall windows. For the first time since her arrival, the music room no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. She wore a gown of soft periwinkle silk, modest in its neckline but flowing in its lines, with delicate lace at the cuffs and a ribbon at her waist. Her hair was swept up into a simple chignon, with a few tendrils left deliberately loose. There was no jewelry, no ornament, nothing but the quiet dignity she carried like a flame in her chest. Theodore had not yet appeared. The guests arrived slowly, as if testing the temperature of scandal before daring to immerse themselves in it. Carriages lined the gravel drive, wheels gleaming, footmen dressed in gold-trimmed livery. Women in gowns of shimmering pastel stepped down onto the stone steps, their fans fluttering in practiced choreography. Men in cravats and evening coats followed, their eyes scanning the house with the predatory curiosity of society, always on the hunt for weakness. But what they found instead was light and music. Lila greeted them in a cream dress with a blue sash, Charlie standing solemnly beside her, one hand clutching Dorothy's as they passed from room to room. The children had not been rehearsed. They had been transformed. When Theodore finally entered the music room, he did so without flourish. He wore a black tailcoat and ivory waistcoat, a cravat tied with understated elegance. His silver-streaked hair had been brushed back, and he walked without his cane for the first time in public since the accident, though Dorothy could see the effort in every step. Their eyes met across the room. It was not a look of performance. It was a question, unspoken but burning, and she answered with a nod so slight only he could see it. The musicale began with a duet between violin and cello, the notes spiraling into the vaulted ceilings like prayers. Guests murmured approval. Champagne was sipped. Laughter drifted, hesitant but growing, but it was during the fourth piece, a nocturne played by a young pianist from Boston, that Dorothy felt it, the shift. No longer was she being observed as an anomaly, a curiosity, a scandal in waiting. She was part of the room, a thread woven through the very fabric of the evening. And when Theodore crossed the room toward her, the crowd parted instinctively. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, bowing slightly, "may I have this dance?" Her heart paused, but her hand did not tremble as she placed it in his. The quartet began a slow waltz. The rhythm was tender, forgiving. They moved together cautiously at first. His steps measured, hers attuned to his lead. Their hands met not with flourish, but with familiarity. Her other hand rested lightly on his arm, and for the first time she felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Around them the room softened, voices hushed, scandal held its breath. Theodore's gaze never left hers. Every step they took was an unspoken sentence, every turn an admission. They were not dancing for the eyes around them. They were dancing to remember what it meant to feel, without shame, without fear. "You're shaking," she whispered. "I haven't done this in years," he replied, his voice rough, "and never like this." The final notes lingered in the air as they came to a gentle stop. Theodore bowed. Dorothy curtsied. The room erupted into quiet applause, not forced, not polite, but reverent. She stepped back, allowing the next couple to take the floor, her breath uneven. The music continued, but for her the moment had already been composed, and it echoed still. Later, long after the last guest had gone and the candles had burned low, Dorothy returned to her chamber. Her slippers in hand, the ribbon at her waist loosened. She stood at her desk and took out the letter. Theodore's letter. She unfolded it with care and read it again, this time aloud, as if daring the words to breathe fully in her space. "Dorothy, there are things I cannot say aloud." Her voice faltered only once, but she pressed forward. Each sentence carved deeper, not wounds, but foundations. He had written not of desire, but of admiration, need, and fragile hope. He had written her name as if it belonged to something sacred. When the letter ended, she sat down and drew out fresh parchment. Her hand hovered over the page. Then she began. "Theodore, you speak of storms. I have weathered them all my life. But what you offer me now is not shelter. It is a place to choose whether I remain. That choice is not small. It is everything." D. She did not sign more. She did not need to. In another part of the city at that very moment, Mr. Whitcomb sat in a salon furnished with overconfidence and oil portraits of self-importance. The newspaper in his lap was folded neatly, but his jaw was tight. The article he had once orchestrated had been overtaken. There had been no scandal at the musicale, no shame, no drama. Instead, the press wrote of elegance, of Ashbury's return to public life, of his children's poise, and, most galling of all, of Miss Whitcomb's grace and fortitude in the face of gossip's bite. Whispers that once slithered in shadow were now shifting. Business contacts hesitated to reply to his letters. A bank director he once called a friend had not returned a call in days. And somewhere between society's cynicism and its reluctant awe, the image of Dorothy had transformed, not into legend, but into something far more dangerous, into truth. Back at the estate, Dorothy stepped once more into the now empty music room. The moonlight glistened on the piano, the silence soft and golden. She crossed to the telescope and touched it lightly. There was no audience, no performance, only the soft echo of a dance, and a letter folded once more, waiting to be read. The great hall of the Ashbury mansion shimmered with candlelight and tension. The crystal chandeliers overhead held their breath. Every flicker of flame on polished silver, every whisper that floated across the velvet-draped room, trembled with expectation. Newport's finest had gathered, bankers with their gold watch chains, heiresses in silk so fragile they rustled like secrets, socialites cloaked in lace and curiosity, and at the center of it all stood a woman who had once been cast out like an inconvenience. Dorothy Whitcomb moved to the front of the room with a grace that defied the fire beneath her ribs. Her gown was simple, cream satin with embroidered ivy at the hem and collar, a symbol chosen not for fashion, but for meaning. Ivy, she had once read, clings and endures. Behind her, Theodore stood near the French doors, his cane steady, his posture tall despite the burden in his leg. He did not approach the podium. He did not need to. The entire room, though they watched her, was aware of his silence, his steadiness, his presence. Dorothy placed her gloved hands on the mahogany podium. The sheet of notes she had prepared remained untouched. Her voice, when it rose, was not loud, but it carried, like the sea air before a storm. "I was not raised to speak in rooms like this," she began, her gaze sweeping the rows of faces adorned with diamonds and intent. "I was raised to listen, to smile, to take my place in the order of things. But tonight I asked to speak not for position, but for something far more enduring." She paused, the hush deepening. "I have seen what grief does to a home. I have seen how silence can build its own walls, higher than stone, thicker than pride, and I have seen what happens when someone chooses to stay and listen past the silence, when someone dares to build again, even after the world has told them they are finished." A murmur stirred in the corner, approval perhaps, or discomfort. "I am not here to defend my presence in this house, nor to justify what cannot be measured by titles or wealth. I am here to speak of dignity, of how it lives not in fortune, but in how we treat one another when no one is watching." For a moment no one breathed, then came the rupture, a voice, sharp, seasoned, filled with righteous authority. "And what of manipulation, Miss Whitcomb?" The crowd parted slightly, turning toward the voice that had long thundered in boardrooms and echoed through parlor walls. Mr. Whitcomb stepped forward, the gleam of fury barely disguised beneath his tailored navy coat. "You speak of dignity, yet you arrived in this house through a father's mercy, and now you sit at the table of a grieving man, whispering in his children's ears, while securing your own comfort." Gasps rippled, like stones dropped in still water. Dorothy did not flinch, nor did Theodore move. "Do you deny, Miss Whitcomb?" her father continued. That your place here has caused embarrassment to your family name, that your refusal to obey me has cost you your rightful future, that I offered you a marriage of respect and you spat upon it like a common girl chasing sentiment?" She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time, she did not see a father. She saw a man frightened of losing control. "No," she said, her voice still calm, "I do not deny refusing the future you laid out for me. I only deny that it was ever mine to begin with." Before the silence could settle, Theodore stepped forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet weight that pulled every gaze. His cane struck the floor once as he moved to stand beside Dorothy. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he reached inside his coat and drew out a folio, thin, bound in soft leather. With deliberate movements, he handed it to the nearest gentleman on the board of Whitcomb Enterprises. "You may verify these with your clerks," Theodore said, his tone cool as silver. "They include the transfer records and voting rights of every share I purchased over the last 6 weeks." Mr. Whitcomb's face froze. Theodore looked at him, not with triumph, but with finality. "Your company is no longer yours." A hush fell so complete, the candle seemed to lean into it. Dorothy turned slightly toward her father. Her hands, still gloved, rested at her sides. Her chin lifted. "You came here to shame me," she said softly. "To offer me one final bargain, obedience, in exchange for silence. But I will not be silent. And I will not marry a man I do not know, to salvage pride that was never mine to protect." Someone in the crowd, Lady Hargrave perhaps, let out a soft murmur of admiration. Mr. Whitcomb opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. He looked at Theodore, at Dorothy, at the crowd who no longer looked through her but at her, and then he turned and walked away, shoulders stiff, the weight of power removed from his stride like armor shed on a battlefield. Theodore exhaled, though barely. Dorothy did not. They did not embrace. They did not whisper. They simply stood, side by side, quiet, breathing the same air as though for the first time. That night, long after the guests had gone, and the laughter had been folded away like linens after a fete, Dorothy climbed the stairs to the second floor. Her gown had been changed for a house robe of dusky blue, and her hair hung in a long braid down her back. She carried no candle. She needed no light. She entered the music room where the fire still flickered low and where the telescope rested quietly by the window. And there, on the piano bench, lay a sealed envelope. Her name written in ink that had begun to fade. She had found it days ago, hidden, half-intended, and read it in silence. A letter of love without demand, of admiration without design. A letter that saw her not as a fragile thing to be saved, but as something bright, chosen. She sat, the fire crackled, and she drew out her own envelope. The parchment was crisp, her script careful. "Theodore, I once asked myself if I would vanish in this house. If I would become just another piece of silent furniture politely thanked, but never really seen. I no longer ask that. I am seen. Not for what I was born into, but for who I have become. You never tried to rescue me. You simply made it safe to become something more, and for that I will not leave, not because I have nowhere to go, but because I have already arrived." She folded the letter gently, placed it beside his. Two voices, finally in conversation. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes drifting toward the glass, where the sea shimmered in moonlight beyond the cliffs. Somewhere in the quiet, she heard footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant, just approaching. The mornings in Newport had softened. The scent of salt lingered in the sunlit corridors, and the house, once silent as a chapel, now echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the rustling pages of a life no longer paused. Weeks had passed since the night of reckoning, since Dorothy had left her answer on the piano bench, beside the letter that had waited too long for a reply. Neither she nor Theodore had spoken of the letters aloud, but something had shifted between them, something that required no declaration. The mansion itself had changed. Doors no longer creaked closed. Music no longer lay trapped in silence. Even the light that filtered through the high-arched windows felt warmer, more willing to stay. Down the hall, a shriek of delight rose from Charlie, followed by the rapid patter of his feet as he ran toward the front stairs, brandishing a carved wooden ship in one hand. "Lila! He's gone toward the west wing!" came the teasing cry of a maid, half laughing, half feigning exasperation. From the second-floor landing, Lila called back with mock sternness, "Captain Ashbury, the drawing room is not a harbour." But her voice held no edge, only joy. Her once perfectly parted hair now swayed in loose braids, her skirts gathered for play rather than display. In the library, Dorothy sat in an armchair by the fireplace, a book open in her lap. The flames crackled gently, and near her elbow rested a half-finished letter to her cousin in Philadelphia, though the ink had long dried on the last line. She hadn't the heart to close it yet. Instead, she let Lila, seated on a low stool beside her, twist her hair into a slow, uneven braid. "You've a gentle hand, Miss Lila," Dorothy murmured, her voice tender, amused. "I'm practicing," Lila said. "When I grow up, I'll be the one who braids my children's hair." She glanced up shyly. "I'll teach Charlie to help too." Dorothy's hand closed gently over the girl's. "I have no doubt you'll teach him many things." From the corner, the old music box sat open on a lace runner. The melody, once ghost-like in its sorrow, now floated through the air like a lullaby newly born. It played often now, though no one ever quite said who wound it each morning. That evening, after supper had ended and the children had disappeared upstairs to plot their latest escapades, Dorothy stepped onto the veranda with the soft click of heels on tile. A wrap hugged her shoulders. The sea beyond the cliffs yawned wide, dark, and endless, but no longer seemed like a threat. It was simply there, breathing. She crossed to the far end, where the telescope stood, its brass frame polished, the tripod now secured to the wooden slats beneath. A soft breeze teased a strand of hair across her cheek. She knelt slowly, then opened a small satchel and removed 2 letters. The first, Theodore's, had been carefully refolded, preserved in its original ink-stained creases. The second bore her own marginalia, notes in her fine looping script, questions beside his phrases, affirmations, a disagreement written in bold, a shared joke circled and underlined, not a reply but a conversation. She placed both gently on the small table beside the telescope and pressed a paperweight over them. There was no need to hide them anymore. Later that night, she found Theodore in the parlor, seated across from Charlie at the chessboard. The boy squinted in concentration, a fingertip on the edge of a rook. "You've set a trap, haven't you?" Charlie asked, eyeing his father suspiciously. Theodore's brow lifted, amused. "That depends. Are you planning to walk into it?" Charlie giggled and moved a pawn. Dorothy leaned in the doorway, unnoticed for a moment. The fire lit Theodore's features from below, softening the sharpness that had once defined his grief. His eyes, those clear, stormy eyes, watched his son not with calculation but quiet affection. His hand, resting near his cane, remained still. It wasn't until later, when the house had quieted and the night wore a robe of silver mist, that Theodore sought her. She stood again on the veranda, this time barefoot, the hem of her cotton gown brushing against her ankles. He did not call out to her. She knew he was there by the shift in the air. She turned. "You found them," she said. "I did," he answered. He looked down at the letters, still pinned beneath the weight of glass. The telescope beside them pointed out toward the horizon, where the sea merged with sky in an endless hush. "I read your margins," he murmured. Dorothy smiled faintly. "Did you find your answers?" "No," he said, "but I found my courage to keep asking." They stood together in the hush, where the stars overhead bore silent witness. He did not touch her, but his nearness was a warmth against her skin. "I haven't used the cane much today," he said after a pause. "I noticed," she replied softly. He looked down at it, then back at her. "I still bring it, habit perhaps." "Or armor," she offered. He gave a slow nod. It's been both. Dorothy reached out, not to take his arm, but simply to place her hand near his. You don't have to put it down, she said. Just don't lean on it unless you must. The next morning broke soft and golden. The children burst from the house like birds released from a cage, Charlie carrying his ship, Lila her sketchpad. Theodore followed them, a cane in hand but unneeded. Dorothy walked beside him, her skirts lifting slightly with each breeze. They made their way down the gravel path to the shore, where the sea awaited, patient as ever. At the edge of the sand, Charlie ran ahead, his feet kicking up salt-wet clumps. Lila held Dorothy's hand, then released it to gather shells. Theodore paused beside her. You were given away, he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the waves. As punishment. And she looked up at him, her brow gentle. Yes, but you became more, he continued. You didn't bend, you built. Dorothy turned toward the water. I didn't build alone. They walked together, hand in hand, their steps leaving uneven prints in the wet sand. Behind them, Lila and Charlie followed, weaving their own path, the laughter of children layering the sound of surf. The cane tapped the shore once, then again, but Theodore's weight remained evenly distributed. His gait was steady, measured, no longer defined by pain. At a bend in the shore where the cliffs rose like ancient guardians and the tide stretched far and clear, they stopped. Theodore looked down at their hands entwined, then at the children beside them. A family, he whispered. Dorothy nodded. By choice. He looked out to sea. By resilience. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. By love. And in that still, unguarded moment, there was no music playing, no orchestra, no dramatic swell, but the waves sang. The sky opened, and the woman who had been discarded, silenced, used as a bargaining chip, now stood at the very center of what she had helped create. Not a home built by inheritance, but by healing, by hope, and by hearts that had learned to listen. Newport, 1905. The wind still danced along the cliffs, though the trees were taller now, and the house at the end of the path wore ivy like a memory, soft, stubborn, and green even in winter's breath. From the veranda, Dorothy watched the children play by the sea. Lila, nearly 17, had become a fierce protector of beauty, sketching the shoreline with practiced hands, her brow furrowed with concentration, as if capturing light was a sacred duty. Charlie, now 12, had lost none of his wonder, though his limbs had stretched and his voice had begun to crack with change. He still ran with the same abandon, calling to the gulls as though they answered him in kind. And there, beneath the slope of a willow tree, a smaller figure toddled after a red ball, her curls wild and sunlit, her laughter clear as glass chimes in the wind. Amelia, just past her second birthday, Theodore's daughter. Dorothy's daughter. The child had been born on a February night when the tide was high and the wind restless, as if the sea itself had leaned in to listen. She'd come with strong lungs and calm eyes, much like her father. From the moment Theodore first held her, cane forgotten at the side of the bed, Dorothy had seen the final piece of something settle into place. Behind her, the door creaked open, and Theodore stepped out with a blanket in his arms. His hair had gone silver at the temples, his limp now faint, almost indistinct, but his eyes remained steady, ever clearer with time. She forgot this again, he said, holding up the child's bonnet. Our daughter has no respect for weather. Dorothy chuckled softly. She has no fear of anything. Remind you of someone? He asked, wrapping the blanket gently around her shoulders. Of everyone I've ever loved, she whispered, leaning into his warmth. 5 years had not dulled what they built. It had deepened it, polished it like stone, smoothed by the sea. Their love was no longer breathless or uncertain. It was woven into rituals, a shared cup of tea, a glance across a crowded room, the way Theodore kissed the crown of her head each evening without fail. He still limped. She still teased him about his poor taste in neckties, but their home was filled now with more than memory. It was layered with music, color, and the breath of new life. The summer after their wedding, the scandal that had once threatened to unravel them was all but forgotten. Mr. Whitcomb had vanished into the folds of social irrelevance, his own company absorbed, his legacy rewritten by Theodore's steady hand and Dorothy's quiet diplomacy. No public disgrace was ever declared, but the absence of invitations, the withdrawal of support, and the slow closing of doors had spoken loud enough. He'd paid a price, not in headlines, but in isolation. Lila had become her own force. Dorothy had kept her promise, enrolling the girl in a women's academy in Boston, where she thrived among thinkers and dreamers. Each summer, she returned more certain of her path, to paint, to publish, to speak boldly. Charlie, more grounded, had taken to engineering sketches, often found with his head bent beside his father's ledgers, asking endless questions about rail lines and turbines. And Amelia, she would grow up never knowing what it meant to be silenced or sold. The society that once whispered behind Dorothy's back now invited her to lead charitable boards and sit on educational panels. They called her Mrs. Ashbury with reverence, but she still preferred when Theodore called her simply Dorothy, the name he'd first spoken not as a title, but as a possibility. Sometimes she would reread their old letters, still kept in the drawer of the music room. The ink had faded slightly, but the meaning remained as vivid as the day it was written. Their dialogue continued, in the margins of books, in the notes they passed when one couldn't sleep, in the music box that now belonged to Amelia and played lullabies each night by her crib. As twilight bled across the sky, casting gold over the waves, Dorothy took Theodore's hand. His fingers curled around hers with the same quiet certainty she had felt 5 years ago. "You remember," he said, "what you told me that first year, that you wouldn't stay because you needed saving." "I remember," she replied. "And now?" She looked toward the sea, where 3 children chased a skipping ball across the sand, their shadows dancing in the fading light. "Now I stay," she said, her voice trembling with peace, "because this is where I became myself." The tide lapped gently at the shore, carrying away the years that once wounded, and bringing in the ones they had built, together. And in the hush between waves, the past folded itself into memory, while love, true, tested, enduring, stood as the quiet force that had turned punishment into purpose, solitude into home, and strangers into a family bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable choice to belong. What if the place you were sent to as punishment became the place where you healed? Dorothy Whitcomb's story is not just about love, it's about resilience, about how dignity begins when we choose ourselves, even when the world tries to choose for us. It's about the quiet revolution of building something beautiful after everything has been broken. And it's a reminder that family isn't always who we're born to, but who walks beside us when the storms come. If this story moved you, if you felt seen through Dorothy's journey, let us know in the comments. Tell us what part stayed in your heart. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word belonging in the comments. We'll know you're one of us, and it will help more people discover this story. If you wish to support the team that lovingly brings these period romances to life, you can now send a super thanks on YouTube with any amount you feel inspired to give. It helps us continue creating stories that honor emotion, depth, and the timeless beauty of second chances. And if that's not possible right now, simply sharing this video with a friend is a beautiful way to support what we do. Don't forget to check the cards on screen. We've selected other powerful love stories filled with drama, healing, and hope, just like this one. Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the quietest house, even after loss, love can still come knocking.